thanks, Monica. Good morning, everybody. I'm gonna time myself because I can go long, and I'm gonna endeavor to keep this short, and then just kind of address questions, hopefully through our conversation. My name is Erica. I am a writer. I run a website called Publicola, covering local politics and news in Seattle. And I also recently published a book called Quitter about my own experience with drinking and relapse. And I have been in recovery for about 6 years now. So I did not start out as a drinker. I started out as a perfectionist. I started drinking really not until my 30s. But before that, I grew up in Texas. I was a typical kind of high achieving kid, went to college on a scholarship, had a job as an editor by the time I was 21 years old. And I felt like an imposter, and I had a lot of anxiety in my life because I had kind of risen so quickly, and I was so young, and I was around people that I thought were much more sophisticated and experienced than I was. I was working in alternative weekly papers, which for example, if you're in Seattle, like The Stranger. And eventually I actually got a job with The Stranger, moved out from Texas, and started working in papers out here. And that is when my drinking really got started. I think a lot of women end up hitting their kind of alcoholic or drinking stride in their 30s, as we are emerging into our careers. And that was certainly true for me. Drinking was just seamlessly integrated into every aspect of my life. So from relaxing after work with friends from work to taking meetings at the bar. And, I know this is true of like a lot of professions, not just journalism and politics, but it's definitely true in journalism and politics. And for a lot of people, I think that is just kind of normal, and you go through your day-to-day life and drinking and not really thinking about it. But for me, I had a really dramatic and steep decline into very heavy drinking and late stage alcoholism between about 2008, when I went to detox for the first time, and 2014, when I got fired from my job for some of the symptoms of my addiction, for acting out and just kind of not being there in various ways, which you can read about in my book if you haven't. It took me countless attempts to get sober. I started trying, as I said, in 2008. I went to detox. I thought that was it for me. I thought, great, I'm going to dry out. I'll be fine. And that was totally not the case. So I relapsed over and over and over again. And the reason my book is called a memoir of drinking, relapse, and recovery is because relapse is a huge part of my story. We can get into, hopefully we'll get into this a little bit more later, but relapse was a really important part of my story. And it is, I think, part of the reason that I was able to get sober was the experience I gained through relapsing over and over and over again. And when I finally quit, it wasn't because I hit some dramatic rock bottom, because I had already hit countless rock bottoms by that point. I had lost my job. I had lost a lot of my friends. My parents didn't pick up my calls anymore. And I was really close to getting evicted from my apartment. And none of that got me to quit. What got me to quit was I woke up one day and I realized I was done. And I called a cab. I called the detox center first. Fortunately, got into detox, which is not always an easy feat. Called a cab, paid $100, wrote a check because I didn't have any money, and said, please, don't cash this for 2 days until I have some money in my account. Went to detox, got out, and started going to meetings and started doing the work. So it was just this tiny internal shift that happened that made it possible. And so I hope we can get into some of the myths around drinking and recovery and what it takes. But that's what it took for me. So with that, I will stop and hand it over to Jenny.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erica. And thank you, Monica, for hosting this. I'm really excited and passionate about sharing my story as well. And I'm a mental health counselor and a substance use counselor by profession now, but I really personally am affected by alcohol as well. It's really interesting to me. It's kind of funny. I share so much of I can relate so much to Erica's story, and actually very similar timeline as well. I'm in recovery. My sobriety date is February 14th of 2014. So similar amount of sobriety time. I spent most of my 20s also struggling with alcoholism, and for me, addiction runs in my family, and I had that knowledge growing up, but I didn't think that it would affect me personally. I was a high achiever and thought that if I just performed well, that I could handle anything. Um, I had some, a lot of the research talks about trauma being a factor with developing alcoholism, and I definitely had some of that in my teenage years. And so what happened was, when I went to college, I just kind of thought that that type of drinking was normal. And when most of my friends started developing a professional career, I was kind of still stuck in the college years, and I didn't quite launch. They talk a lot about failure to launch, in the 20, 23, 24 years old. And so that didn't happen for me. And I actually took a turn, just couldn't, my alcoholism really took off. And so I actually had some legal consequences, which forced me into getting help. I was much more resistant to getting help. Everyone around me knew that I needed it, but I was very stubborn and rebellious. And so I kind of jumped through the hoops, or tried to jump through the hoops that didn't really work well for me. And so, addiction is progressive. It definitely, Erica talked about, hitting rock bottom. I had a very low bottom as well. And for me, what I think I struggled with the most in trying to get sober is that I wasn't fitting this mold of what an alcoholic is. And, I grew up in middle class, and I wasn't a bum sitting under a bridge. And so I couldn't be an alcoholic. It wasn't until I went to treatment and was surrounded by folks that were actually more well off than me that I thought, oh my gosh, if they have a problem, maybe I could too. So I wasn't connecting with this idea of what an alcoholic was. And the shame also really kept me stuck. So, I went to treatment 5 times. A lot of people will think, gosh, what's the point of treatment if you just keep going? And I had gotten to a point where my family had really kind of given up on me. It was the last time. I don't know what was different. I think I relate to Erica as well, in that I kind of just was done. I started to want to become sober. For a while, I thought that I couldn't do it. And deep down inside of me, I always wanted to help other people. I didn't know the context of what that would look like, but after I started to get sober, I decided to go back to school and become a counselor. And so it's very a fulfilling journey for me now. My husband and I own Family Centered Services, which helps people get to treatment. We do interventions and counseling, and we work with families. We found that that's a big part of relapse, is that when folks go to treatment and they come back to their family, if nothing has changed, it's very difficult for them to stay sober. And so that's a big part of where we think that there's a missing link. So we're really passionate about that. And with that, I will also wrap up. I'm very excited to join in the conversation on some of the questions that we'll pose today. So thank you.
Thank you both. Those were really interesting stories and very different. And I think that there's no real profile for someone going through addiction. I'm guessing that several people on this call, because I hear friends joking about it all the time, but how do you know if you have a problem with alcohol, and how did you know when you had a problem? Like, was there an event? Like, when did you recognize to yourself, not necessarily when you were ready to seek treatment, but when did you know you had a problem?
Well, I can go first. I mean, I think I knew I had a problem when I was drinking every single day. And when I started, it wasn't when I started drinking alone, but it was when it started feeling like I had to drink every day and I had to drink to sort of feel comfortable in my own skin. And so that was, probably 2007. So I'm just dating that to say, about 7 years before I actually quit. Um, and yeah, I mean, I was pretty convinced I had a problem by then. I was never in the kind of denial that I know a lot of people have. I knew I had a problem and I knew I should quit, but I just didn't feel like I could.
And Jenny, maybe a two-part question for you both. How did you know? And then for the audience, like, how does someone recognize when they have a problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's a lot of, I work with a lot of folks that ask that question themselves. They'll come and say, I'm kind of concerned I might have a problem with drinking. And it's really, so there's two parts to that. For me, denial was a big part of realizing I had a problem. Like everyone in my family and in my circle, my friends, they all knew it way, way before I did. So denial was a big piece for me, which kept me from getting sober for a very long time. And it's a very frustrating part of alcoholism if you love someone that is struggling, that's very challenging. If you, secondly, if you're questioning if you have a problem, there's a really great, there's a ton of self-assessments you can do. And I would just encourage folks to really answer those questions honestly. Deep down for me, I would say that I knew it was there. I just did everything I could to kind of shut that little voice up in my head that was like, yeah, you probably have a problem with this, but let's just drink more to avoid listening to that voice. And so, there's a great assessment called the audit. I've provided that in the resources. It will ask you questions like how much you're drinking, the frequency, the amount, do you drink it, alone? Have family members or coworkers expressed concern? There's some cues there that can help you self-diagnose. And then, the next step to that would be, talking with someone to help you discover that for yourself.
And I
Thanks.
think,
Oh, go ahead, Erica.
I think that, my sort of non-professional test for this has always been something somebody said to me early on, which is, okay, well, try quitting for a month or 6 months and see how that goes. And I mean, for me, that was like a laughable proposition because I couldn't quit for a day because that's just the kind of drinker I was. But for a lot of people, the answer may be, well, I can, but it'll make me really uncomfortable. Or, or you quit for a month and you find yourself kind of resenting that you can't have that drink at the end of the day because you deserve it. That kind of thing. I mean, I think that one of the things that keeps people from asking these questions is this idea that there is one kind of quote unquote alcoholic. And this is just, my belief based on personal experience and observation, but there are all kinds of drinking problems. Not all of them are alcoholism. Like there is an over reliance on alcohol to avoid problems that doesn't rise to the level of like, you have to go to a church basement every night, which I think is what people dread. And which, I mean, I don't think you should dread that either if that ends up being part of your life, but there are gradations of unhealthy relationships to alcohol that we should be willing and able to examine without that fear and without the shame that kind of is associated with the idea of calling yourself an alcoholic.
Yeah. Jenny, do you find that there are some common triggers for alcoholism for women specifically? And are they different than triggers for men? Like, what do you find with your client base?
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely the anxiety, there's mental health, we call them co-occurring disorders. And so there's some mental health issues that I think both men and women struggle with, but the shame, the shame aspect and the anxiety aspect is usually very high in women. Shame, particularly in that, that label of being an alcoholic and what does this mean about me? For men, I think it's more, it's normalized to go drink with the guys, and it's part of the coworkers really help instigate that. But for women, it's more like, you have to be presentable, you have to be ladylike. And we actually find that it's funny with Alcoholics Anonymous. It originally developed, it was just a men's only group. Al-Anon was actually the group that women created as like the wives for the men that were drinkers. But yeah, getting back to your question, it's the shame, anxiety, those are things that are really prevalent. And I know, Erica has mentioned like the anxiety with being able to, drink and avoid being in your own skin. I totally, I definitely relate to that as well. Drinking becomes kind of this social lubricant where it's like, okay, now I can feel like myself. And when we take that away, it's very hard to stay sober because we don't have that. We have to learn how to manage the anxiety.
This reminds me of Erica, when we were first talking about this event, and you wrote me such a concise and kind of funny description of the difference between men and women, how like when a man gets drunk. Will you just tell that story? And that might be a good time for you to read an excerpt from your book.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that for men, it's fitting in with the voice. I mean, as Jenny said, it's like, it's social lubricant, it's accepted. There's all different ways, I think, to be a drinker and be a man, and it's manly. For women, I think that, there are sort of stages of life. You can be like the fun girl in your teens and 20s who drinks. You can be the wine mommy, which I think we've all seen a ton of that sort of rhetoric on social media. And then you can be, I mean, the example I gave was Susan Orlean, the author, because she's sort of on this weird jag right now about drinking. She got really drunk on Twitter, and everybody's sort of celebrating her as the sort of older kooky woman who drinks. And it's, and it struck me that the kind of drinker that I was is not acceptable within any of those parameters. And I think probably the kind of drinker any alcoholic woman is not acceptable within any of those parameters. And it really puts you in this box where, for me, like I was a messy drinker who drank alone in my apartment, and I hid it from everybody, and I was super ashamed of it. And that isn't represented anywhere on social media or in the media in general. You just don't see that. And I think that just totally contributes to the shame problem that we have. And it contributes to this idea that, women drinking is like cute or funny. And that really bothers me. And I think it's tied up in sexism, and it's tied up in, the tiny parameters we're allowed to exist within. So with that, I'm going to read just a short excerpt about what it was like the first time I got sober and was out in the world again. Let me tell you what it's like to be sober, really sober, for the first time in years. It feels like seeing color for the first time. It feels like you've been looking at the world through someone else's glasses, and suddenly you can make out every individual blade of grass. It feels like you have a secret superpower that nobody can see, a clarity of mind that allows you to leach insights out of the most banal moments. Your body feels stronger than it's ever been. Food tastes better. Desire returns. At the same time, everything has an intensity that scares you a little. When you feel a feeling, fuck, how am I ever going to start paying back my debts? You just have to sit with it, figure it out, wait for it to pass. When you've dampened every experience with the white noise of alcohol for a decade or more, experiencing the world at full blast can be overwhelming. Who do I need to apologize to first? How am I ever going to make time for 9 hours of outpatient treatment every week? Do I really have to go to an AA meeting every single day? Why is my boss looking at me like that? Does he think I've been drinking? When we talk about sobriety or even recovery, the words are often shorthand for not drinking or not using drugs. But the really overwhelming part of staying sober isn't saying no to drinks or learning to avoid the proverbial people, places, and situations that induce temptation. It's figuring out how to live an unfiltered life. That's hard enough when things are going pretty much okay. How many times have you said, I need a drink, when what you really mean is, this day was moderately annoying? It can be damn near impossible when there's wreckage stretching out to the horizon in every direction. So I froze. I withdrew to my comfort zone. I worked and went to the gym, lifted weights, and worked the phones. And before long, I was too exhausted to keep going to outpatient therapy 3 times a week, too exhausted to make it to AA every day, too exhausted to do anything besides trudge from work to gym to home to bed. AA meetings, which I'd attended sporadically since I walked into a meeting 7 years earlier, bummed me out. Everybody seemed so happy all the time. And I found the 3-hour intensive outpatient sessions that I had agreed to do as part of my post-rehab treatment program repetitive and depressing. A few sad sack losers gathered on couches in a dreary downtown office building, watching VHS videos about relapse prevention and bitching about how much sobriety sucked before blowing into their ignition interlock devices and driving home. Not more than a month went by before I fell back into drinking. Not jumped, fell. The way you fall into bed with an ex-lover because you don't have anything better going on. I can't pinpoint an exact turning point or moment when I said, screw it, this is too hard. It was more like an imperceptible slide from not drinking to drinking, from militancy to self-pity to indifference to bottoms up. I was a non-drinker, then I was a drinker again, simple as that. I passed the liquor aisle in the grocery store, doubled back, and dropped a bottle of Smirnoff in my basket, casually, like a vegetarian tossing a tray of ground beef on top of the granola bars.
Wow. I mean, like, so let's shift the conversation a little bit and talk about recovery and relapse. That's so overwhelming just to think of the emotional and time commitment that must go into it after making that conscious decision. So Jenny, what are your observations and recommendations like for not giving up, even if you go into relapse, you know?
Yeah, first of all, I have to just say wow as well. That is so powerful and just beautifully written. And I am excited to share your book with a lot of my clients as well and finish it too. I've just really gotten into it. As far as not giving up, that is the toughest thing. You know, there's a cliche that I know Erica will laugh at, but in AA, they say, don't give up before the miracle happens. And when you're new and when you hear that, you think, oh my gosh, I just want to throw up. That's so, corny. But in reality, that's so true. And we say that to family members. Usually families are the most, when we're working with someone struggling, they're really wanting to give up as well. They think, what's going to be different? This is an exhausting disease. I treat it as a disease. And, if someone had cancer and their cancer returned, you wouldn't say, well, just give up. Don't go to the doctor anymore. You wouldn't. So helping society shift that view of alcoholism as a disease, I think helps people see it as something to not give up on. As someone struggling with it and going through the exhausting process, years of drinking and relapse and recovery, just that your life is worth it. And that's a really scary part to be at. I can remember thinking, just throwing in the towel and really considering, like, maybe I just accept this life as an alcoholic. Maybe that's the life I'm supposed to have. And that's a very scary point to be at. And so, just don't give up on yourself. Don't give up on, if you love someone that's struggling, that's pretty much all I can say.
Yeah. Erica, do you want to add on to that, or should I move on to social media?
Well, I do want to add just quickly.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's funny that you mentioned that cliche. One of the things I talk about later in the book is, AA was definitely part of my my own journey to recovery. And there's tons of cliches that you just hate when you go in. And like, I mean, I've never rolled my eyes so hard as I did at that first AA meeting when all the sayings are up on the wall, you know, like think. And anyway, I won't go through all the cliches because there's hundreds of them. But one area where I actually do take issue with AA is that there is this concept of losing your time. Where, you know, if you have like, you know, say a year and you relapse, then you go back to day one. And I think that can be really pernicious. And I understand that celebrating your time is also like a great thing. My sobriety date is February 4th, 2015. So and I know that date. I know approximately how many years and days I have, all that. But you don't lose your time because, and I think that's something people really, you know, struggle with and need to come to realize. Everything that you have learned, and I'll just speak for myself, everything I learned in relapsing and in going to treatment multiple times and in going to detox and in going to therapy and all the things that I did to get sober, ultimately, all of that led to where I am now. There wasn't any one thing. It wasn't like I could have gone to that first AA meeting and personally, you know, walked out and been sober forever. It just took what it took. And so, yes, it can be really exhausting going through that process. But it's time consuming and money consuming is drinking all the time. You lose so much time if you're constantly drunk, if you're trying to figure out what you did in blackouts, if you're going to the liquor store first thing in the morning, as I often was, because I was that kind of drinker. I got in huge, massive debt, and I just didn't understand how people lived. I mean, truly, like I was making a middle-class salary, and I was like, how do people live on this? I don't understand. And it's because I was wasting all my money on alcohol and on medical treatment for all these mysterious ailments that just kept popping up in my life for reasons I couldn't understand. So, it really is better on the other side. And that's one good thing about AA meetings and other kinds of meetings is you get to hear from people who are on the other side of things about how it got better.
Yeah, that's a really good point about losing time, particularly when you're drinking. I mean, it's amazing, like waking up with a hangover and just dealing with a hangover really impacts, I believe, like your effectiveness during the day. And it's great. There's a Deborah Vole on the call this morning, I believe, who I'm hopeful that we'll have a little time to hear from her, because she was talking about making a conscious choice to quit drinking, even though there wasn't an addiction issue, just to recapture time and clarity. You know, like her dedication to her work meant so much that she wanted to be clear-headed. So it would be kind of nice to have the conversation sometime this morning about consciously choosing not to drink, even without the addiction, to be clear. So, but I do want to go back to social media because I'm blown away by everything that you're saying about these memes and references to mommy drinkers and all of that stuff. So I would love to hear your perspective. So Jenny, you want to go first? And like, what are the effects of social media on alcoholism?
Sure. Yeah. Especially during this pandemic, we've seen a dramatic increase in, like Zoom social happy hours, Zoom happy hours, right? And or the not stay at home mom, but the working mom who is trying to homeschool her kids or get their kids set up on, staying at home and doing school, and how she needs a drink at noon, right? All of these memes and the effects of social media are really normalizing problem drinking behavior. And I think, we're definitely seeing an increase in alcoholic alcohol sales, during the pandemic. Just looking at how it's normalizing these behaviors and really encouraging problem drinking at home by yourself. I think that that's something to consider and to really challenge and push back on. Like, okay, maybe we can laugh at this, but really that's not normal. And it's not a healthy way to cope, while we're all, staying more isolated during this time, I think is important to remember.
Erica?
Yeah, I really liked, Jenny, the way you put it, that it's normalizing drinking alone. And the fact is, and I had never really thought about it that way, but when you're sitting in your house, your room in your house where you're with your friends or, whatever group, and you're all drinking at your house, I mean, that's not a normal or healthy behavior, and it may be a coping mechanism. And I totally, I mean, obviously people are relying on drinking more as a coping mechanism for the pandemic and isolation and all that. But I also think, when you're looking at social media, and I mean, I sometimes will just write down the number of times an alcohol is presented to me in my day online. And sometimes it just feels constant. I mean, there's just like from memes, from posts from friends, from advertisements on Twitter. I think it's important to remember that this is all marketing, and there is a massive industry behind the marketing that you are seeing and the pressure that you are feeling, even from people to drink to cope with whatever it is that is going on in your life. And I think that the best thing that I did recently, and this is going to sound very silly, but I stopped looking at Twitter first thing in the morning, because I realized it was getting my anxiety up like right as I got out of bed every single day. And I've stopped doing that. And that is, true. That this is not specifically about drinking, but it's just about social media. I mean, I think it's really important for us all to learn how to take a break from it if we are the type of people who are on social media a lot. And it's really improved my stress levels. Yeah, that's just a little plug against social media, which I am absolutely addicted to, but I'm trying to get less addicted to.
I would love to hear the audience's perspective on social media right now. And like, if you're trying to cut back or what, you can put that in the chat if you want. I know for me, when I choose not to drink, the hardest time is when I go out to dinner with friends. And so I'm curious, when you recognize that you have an addiction, did you find it necessary to change? Like, did you isolate yourself so you wouldn't be put in those situations? Did you change your friends? Like, how did that work socially?
Well, for me, I mean, my friends very much wanted me to quit drinking, and they were all really, really encouraging of that. So I found that the first 6 months or so, I did have to sort of avoid certain places. So I couldn't go to bars. I mean, bar culture was a big part of my life. And so I stopped going to bars for a while. I will say, before the pandemic, I was going to bars again. I don't have a particular problem being around people who are drinking, because in part because my drinking was isolation drinking. So I actually think that the solution to addiction has to involve, it can never involve isolation, because addiction is a disease of isolation. But for some people, it does involve, like, if you're, a drug user or a drinker who drinks with other people, and that's all you do, you have to figure out ways to do other things with those friends. Or if it turns out they're just drinking friends, and I had a few of those at one point, you may have to look at getting other friends. But socially, for me, it was never anything that extreme. I mean, all my friends are still my friends, and we discovered that we can do things like go to brunch or go for a walk or get coffee, which is not a thing that I somehow realized that people actually did in real life. So it just required some adjustments.
How about you, Jenny?
Yeah, I would totally agree with everything Erica said. One of the sayings that I'll tell people is, they'll think, well, what do I have to change? And, really you do need to change the people, places, and things that you're surrounding yourself with, depending on the context of what your drinking looked like. For me, my friends also were very supportive, and my family as well. It definitely, if you're, really trying to prevent yourself from drinking, it's super important to not have alcohol. For me, it was important to not have alcohol in the home, with wherever I was living. If you live with family members that drink, obviously not going out to bars, not putting yourself in tempting situations is really important. But that does go away out, after time or over time, like I can go to a bar now. I don't hang out there. You know, one of my favorite sayings is, if, you know, don't hang out at the barbershop, or if you hang out at the barbershop long enough, you're going to get a haircut, you know? So hanging out in places that are not healthy for me, I don't do anymore, but that does change. And that was really scary, you know, when you start thinking about, well, gosh, can I never go to this place, or can I not hang out with that person? And sure, you know, you just be smart about it, and it gets better.
How do you have recommendations for people who have family members who are struggling with alcohol? Like, is it okay to have alcohol in your house when you're living with someone who is struggling? Or, you know, just any tips that you have for dealing with loved ones with a drinking problem?
Yeah, great question. You know, if they're struggling and they're not willing to work on it, which is a lot of the folks that we'll work with for interventions. You know, not having it in your home isn't really going to do much, because they're going to find a way to drink regardless. But if they're actively working on not drinking, I would absolutely say, you know, don't have it in your home, or have it in a different place that is not easily accessible. You know, it's similar to dieting. If you're living with someone that is on a diet, or they're trying to lose weight, like, you wouldn't have a box of cookies on the kitchen counter, or, you know, a big tempting cake. You know, it's just trying to limit the temptation is very supportive. And they might say, you know, oh, don't worry about it, that's my problem, which is what I did. And I actually found that it was I was very grateful that my family didn't have alcohol in the home for the first year of my sobriety. That actually felt very supportive.
Mm-hmm. Erica, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just going to depend on the family situation and the drinker herself. I totally agree that you know, I live alone, but I have a boyfriend who I've been dating for 5 years, and I've spent a lot of time at his house. He has alcohol in his house. Um, but you know, we had that conversation, and he said, hey, I'm happy to get rid of all this, I don't really drink. And I said, no, it's fine, because I've been sober for long enough that I felt secure. I think it is supportive to take alcohol out of the house if you are living with someone who has you know, a drinking problem. I also think, I totally agree that if you're not ready to get better and to stop drinking, you're going to find it. And, you know, and I mean, I've seen that over and over again. I've had friends who've, you know, stayed with me and drunk me out of house and home. I've done that to people. And I've also known people whose families restricted their access to alcohol in every way they can, and they ended up getting it. And I have a friend, I had a friend who just died of alcoholism recently. You know, and she was like ordering it over the internet. So, you know, I think it's one of the lessons of Al-Anon that, Jenny, you'll know the sayings better than me, is that you didn't cause it, you can't cure it. And there's a third C.
You didn't cause it, you can't cure it, but you can, oh gosh, now I'm on the spot.
Anyway, point being, you as a family member are not responsible for your family member's actions, and you can be supportive, but ultimately it's, you know, it's not your fault if they try to get access to alcohol, because that's the disease of alcoholism.
Control it. That's the third
yes.
one.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry you recently lost a friend. Related to what you were talking about, Arden had a question about, can you talk to someone with a drinking problem in a way they will hear you? Or do people really need to find their own kind of rock bottom? Jenny, you want to start?
Sure. Rock bottom, you know, is really, there's such a debate on that. Is a lot of people will think, well, gosh, your rock bottom is when you decide to stop digging, you know, and that's another really frustrating point, is it's really only the person struggling that can really decide when that happens. And it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be a rock bottom in the context of like, well, gosh, can things get worse? Yes, they always can get worse. When we do interventions for folks, there's also a misconception, family members will think, well, gosh, they need to create their own rock bottom. And that's not true. We actually help people learn how to bring the bottom to their loved one. And that's done through boundaries and limitations. And the Al-Anon principles that I can't control this other person. Well, no, you can't, but you can change your own behavior and what you learn to tolerate and really learn to set limits and boundaries with your loved one that helps them create their bottom. So there is a big misconception that we just have to let them hit rock bottom, especially with, I know we're not talking about opiates, but addiction in general, alcohol is a drug. And so I just kind of lump it all as addiction. When we're dealing with opiates and also alcoholism, Erica just mentioned that she lost someone, this is a deadly disease. So this idea that we have to let people hit rock bottom, I really think has to be smashed because it can kill you. It's not something that we could just have to wait around and let people figure out what their bottom looks like, because that could be a grave.
Yeah, well, it's, in going to meetings for years now, and I don't go that often anymore, but just meeting, tons and tons of people who have gotten sober at various stages of their lives. I've met people who got sober before they turned 21 because they realized that they were on a path that could end up being really damaging or deadly for them. And I've met people when I was in treatment. I'll never forget a woman I met who was in treatment for the 20th time. She had had multiple organ failure. Her skin was yellow from jaundice because her liver wasn't working. And there she was back in treatment. And you would look at that person and say, why is that person not sober or dead? Like, don't they get it? And I just think it's so personal for each person. And like I said, I would say probably my rock bottom was just personally for me, the worst thing that ever happened to me, or at least I perceived it that way at the time, was losing my job. I got fired from my job after showing up to work drunk 2 days in a row and passing out in the bathroom. That is embarrassing. It's horrible. It's, like you look at that and you're like, well, geez, obviously she quit after that, but I didn't. And my personal, revelation that I actually was ready to quit just came kind of on a normal day, which was, a horrible day, like every day, but there wasn't anything different about it. So I think it is so highly personal. And I think trying to push people toward that rock bottom, or waiting for them to hit it, just doesn't work.
And could be dangerous, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good segue to talk about, there was someone in the audience asking just about cutting back, but I had mentioned Deborah Vole, who's on the call. Deborah, I hate to put you on the spot, but do you mind just sharing your perspective in the book that inspired you to consciously choose to cut back or stop drinking?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My name's Deborah, and I live here in Seattle. And I was sort of curious. I actually turned 59 yesterday.
Happy
And
birthday.
so thank you.
Birthday.
But probably 10 years ago, I was on this journey where I'm like, as being a single mom and raising two kids, feeling a lot of anxiety about, keeping things pulled together, finances and all that stuff. And I had been wanting to either cut back like for weekends only, or quit completely for about 10 years. So it was kind of something where every Monday when I drive to work, I'd be thinking, okay, starting today, starting Monday, I'm not gonna drink. And so it was really something of maybe like a little 10-year journey. And it wasn't until this past year that I came across two resources for me. One was a book called Sober Curious, which maybe you have heard about it. It's been out there and talked quite a bit. I think it's Ruby Worthington wrote the book. And then the other one was called This Naked Mind. And she also has a podcast, which is really helpful to hear other people's stories on how they've managed their relationship with alcohol and how they've moved forward or how they've quit with using it. And so I read the book, and a lot of it was very pertinent to me and was very helpful. And so I'd encourage anyone that is thinking of either cutting back or finding what works for them to seek out those resources. It wasn't until I went ahead and decided for myself 2 years ago, while working full time, I decided to start life coaching and doing a podcast. So on top of working full time, I decided to throw some other things in the mix. Why not? So I thought, how am I going to be able to show up for my employer in the best way possible and for my coaching clients? And you can't do that when you're drinking. So you can't have a drink at 4:30 in the afternoon, a little happy hour, and then coach a client at 7 o'clock at night. You just can't do that. So I decided for myself personally, for my lifestyle, that the best thing for me was to go ahead and cut it out completely. So that's what I went ahead and did. So I'm over a year. It was September something. I can't remember the date. I think it's like September 15th or 16th. And I always tell myself, it's that, I have wine in the house. I use it for cooking sometimes. The hardest part for me is when I invite people over for dinner and I'm like, am I supposed to be the one supplying the wine? What am I supposed to be doing? Because I don't really have any. So I always tell people, bring whatever you want to drink. So that's my solution to people.
Well, thank you, Deborah. That's really helpful. Since we don't have very much time, I'd like to explore, what do you do if you think you have a problem? Like, help the audience understand, what are some of the first steps you can take? We will have a list of resources that I'll display at the end, but I'll also email it to everyone that that registered, and I will add Sober Curious and This Naked Mind that Deborah just recommended. So you guys want to take that on?
Sure. So one of the first steps you can do if you think you have a problem is find a counselor that can do an assessment for you. You can also get an assessment done at a treatment program. They can be quite comprehensive. It'll explore all of your history and how much you're drinking. The most important thing that you have to, you don't have to, but the most important thing is really to be honest, which a lot of folks aren't. They're scared. They're scared to find out the results of the assessment. And so a lot of people will underreport, and, it's really just kind of looking at your baseline is what is normal for you, what are you drinking, and then what will happen after that assessment is the person will give you a recommendation. And it's just a recommendation. You don't have to follow it, but they would say, this is the level of care that I would recommend that you do based on what you shared with me.
Jenny, is there any way that can you do that in like the privacy of your own home, or do you actually have to seek out someone to walk you through the assessment?
Well, there's different types of assessments, of course. There's very free, easy, basic assessments online. I've provided that in the resource list that you can do like a self-assessment. If you were more concerned, or, sometimes in the event, like if you were to have a legal consequence, like if you were to get a DUI, they would require that you go get this very comprehensive assessment, which would determine what level of care you would be required to do, that was what led me to treatment in the beginning. So there's
Erica, any suggestions on first steps?
Well, besides sort of taking a look or trying to quit for a period of time, which I think is, is hard for a lot of people. My first step, honestly, before I really started trying to quit, was going to counseling and talking to a counselor about, what was making me want to drink. And I went to cognitive behavioral therapy. I love it. I'm such an advocate for CBT, possibly because I'm a writer and it's a really writing intensive kind of practice. But one thing I would recommend also is just kind of keeping track for maybe a week of what triggers you to want to drink, what triggers you to drink, just, maybe just jotting it down and recognizing what your triggers are and what's causing you to take that first drink. And sometimes that can identify an underlying problem, and that is the problem and not, necessarily the drinking. And sometimes it can identify, a habit that you want to change.
Great. Can you guys see this list of resources that I put up?
Mhm.
So this is what I'll email to all of you. But if you want to jot anything down. So I'm going to stop sharing that since I'm going to go ahead and send it. So we're out of time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, Erica and Jenny, for sharing your perspective. It's been really eye-opening. This is Erica's book. It's awesome. I bought it on Amazon, but hopefully you can go to a local bookstore and buy it. So thank you both so much. And I do want to share first, before we get offline, what we have coming up, because it's pretty exciting.